Now, we're going to build upon our understanding of the plate tectonic history of sub-Saharan Africa by focusing even more on specific key landform features. So now let's look at the current plate tectonic map by focusing in on sub-Saharan Africa. One of the first things we'll notice the plate boundaries on all edges of the African plate we see separation. So we can see all of those arrows are going away from each other. Once again, the African plate has remained fairly stable, and all other continents and plates have drifted away from the African plate. Because sub-Saharan Africa is surrounded mostly by divergent plate boundaries, we don't have a lot of plates colliding with each other. We don't have a lot of bumping and grinding, and so subsequently, we don't have a lot of mountains in sub-Saharan Africa. There are some exceptions to that, and that's, of course, we're going to focus in on that. But one exception would be the tallest point, and that's Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, near the Tanzanian-Kenyan border, and it's 19,000 feet high. So this is a very, very, very tall mountain right there in the middle of pretty much tropical Africa, kind of there in between East and Central Africa. So Mount Kilimanjaro, this essentially has been formed by volcanoes. So it's kind of its nuts and bolts as far as how it's formed, not from plates colliding with each other, really. Instead, it's more from actually plates separating from each other, but that's something I'll talk about here in a minute. And here we see Mount Kilimanjaro, and whoa, wait a minute. This is unbelievable. This is tropical Africa, and they get snow? Actually, they do. So Mount Kilimanjaro, it's such a tall mountain that it has a high enough elevation in which it actually is snow-capped year-round. So this is very crucial. And so there has essentially this stored up water that when it eventually melts during the warmer period, especially down a little bit lower, that then comes in flowing and fills the rivers and adds a lot of vitality to an area that might be suffering from drought or from a dry period. So here we have in tropical Africa snow. Now we'll take a look at the topographic profile of Africa, the continent of Africa, of course, focusing on more on sub-Saharan Africa. So what I've done is I've gone from A to B, so A into the north, B into the south, and so essentially sliced right in the middle of it. And so here is the topographical profile here in the yellow box. So one of the things you'll notice is Africa is also referred to as the plateau continent, and that's because for the most part on all sides of it, it's very, very steep from coastline from the water to the actual landmass, very steep slope. And so we can see that both on the north and the south side. Now, this plays a key role in terms of transportation and essentially connections with Africa and the outside world. And so it's for much of the 1500s through 1800s, Africa was avoided by a lot of the Europeans. Why? It was difficult to actually penetrate because you had these very, very, very steep slopes abutting right up against the coastline. And so we call these, when we look in the southern part of Africa, there in sub-Saharan Africa, the escarpment. And that's essentially just a term for a sudden increase in elevation along a coastline, in which southern Africa, we see that. So if you're a Dave Matthews Band fan, their very first album was called Under the Table and Dreaming. Dave Matthews grew up in South Africa, right underneath, near Table Mountain, which is essentially part of the escarpment. So he was under the table, so more the metaphor, the table was not the kitchen table, but actually the Table Mountain. So under the table and dreaming of big and better things, dreaming of playing at concerts in which 15-year-olds are getting hammered and puking all over the place. Here I've drawn a line showing the escarpment, and the dashed line is just essentially where the escarpment continues up. Technically, it's not maybe considered the escarpment, but it's definitely kind of this plateau feature. It's very similar in its landform feature. There are a few different key rivers in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. There's the Niger River, for example, the Orange River somewhere else. But the one in which it's pretty much the only one that was penetrable by Europeans was the Congo River. And if you kind of just look at the topographical profile, here it's actually the lowest lying in terms of access. And so the Congo River didn't have this huge elevation change like we maybe see in other parts of Africa where there are higher elevations. So actually here we have a river in which you could actually get into and go deeper into the African continent in the interior. However, this is in a jungle, so it was much more difficult. And so just kind of building to this idea that Africa and its landform features has kind of left it in a situation where it was isolated because of its just couldn't penetrate. You couldn't actually get into the continent. Of course, transportation mechanisms have changed, but back in the day that played a key role. And here I've identified the location of the Congo River basin, the rivers that come together to form it. And it's in a relatively flat area. However, as we're going to find out, it's in a very, very dense tropical rainforest. Next, I'm going to take you up here to this rather rugged area that we see in the African transition zone, kind of up here with East Africa, really up there, not too far from the Middle East. Up there with North Africa and Central Africa, kind of this area where you see a large mix. And here's another map that shows the rugged topography, and here we have the Ethiopian highlands. And so that's in the previous map, that brown rugged area that we can see here is quite undulating. It's called the Ethiopian highlands. And so here we have an area that's just a little bit higher elevation. So this is going to play a key role when we come back and talk about orographic precipitation. It definitely plays a role in climate, in which we have wet sides and dry sides and all of that stuff. Further, because it's a fairly hot continent, a little bit of highland, a little bit of upland is going to make it more attractive for people to live because it's cooler. And so we're going to find a very dense, a highly populated area of the continent because of this relief from a little bit of topography. Further, this is also an area where we see large origins of humankind. And so early ancestors of human beings, this is where we find a lot of their fossils as well. So a lot of history here goes along with a lot of the physical geography that we're going to talk about right now. Now I'm going to focus in on this area here where the blue flashing line is. So here we have the Arabian plate meeting with the African plate. And so we have plate separation going on. So the plates are separating, and that's what's formed that water body in between the two plates. Essentially is the Red Sea, which is a gap being formed as two plates separate from each other. That plate separation is crucial for understanding these next landform features, the Afar Triangle and the Great Rift Valley, which are both, for the most part, in East Africa. Of course, the Great Rift Valley kind of borders East Africa and Central Africa. Here we have the Afar Triangle, and I zoomed in on it, and you can actually, as I fade in the triangle, you can actually somewhat see this landform feature from the satellite imagery. But what we have here is, we've mentioned before, in the Arabian plate is separating from the African plate. But actually, the Arabian plate, in this particular part of the world, the Arabian plate is separating from the African plate, which is within it separating into two different plates. And so essentially we have the African plate separating into two parts. At the same time, the Arabian plate is separating from both African areas. And so we can kind of visualize this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to fade in this red. And so the red is just essentially the shapes. And if you look at the shapes, we can actually see how these puzzle pieces fit together. And so if I take that right angle, which is the Arabian Peninsula, so there on the top right, I can kind of fit that into the other right angle, the other red two lines. I can kind of fit that corner in. And so essentially we can see how the plates are separating over time. And so the Arabian plate is separating from the African plates in this particular Afar Triangle. And so we're going to have continued plate separation, so it's only going to get farther and farther away. So the Arabian Peninsula and the African continent are just slowly drifting apart. So now we zoom out a little farther, and we look a little bit to the south of the Afar Triangle, and we see the Great Rift Valley. And so these yellow lines here that are flashing are essentially the valley, the Great Rift Valley. And so what's happening here is we see the yellow line is where we see separation occurring. And so we've mentioned beforehand, the Arabian plate is separating from the African plate. But even further, the African plate is separating within it into two individual plates. And so we have the Nubian plate and the Somalian plate. So the Afar triangle is the specific point where three plates are separating from each other. But if we continue on, this plate separation is occurring actually farther down into the continent of Africa, in which we have two different plates separating from each other, which we can see the separation on land. So here's a colleague of mine took this photo. The photo just essentially shows very fresh separation, very fresh divergence, as slowly but surely Africa breaks up into two separate plates. I like to make a lot of complex animations to further explain things, but to kind of visualize this triple plate separation. Maybe my previous illustrations didn't show it. Hopefully this will, as we go through and show plates separating from each other, and thus the gap getting bigger over time. Now, what we have very close to this plate separation is we have, of course, water bodies. We have the Red Sea and then nearby the Indian Ocean. And so you can expect, as we get more separation, that the Indian Ocean will actually come in to fill in the cracks as these plates separate from each other. No, I'm getting a bit redundant here, but just visualizing divergent plates. And in the case of this particular area of the world, we have a lot of rain. And so when you have these gaps that are formed, and then you get a lot of rain, what's going to come in to fill those gaps? Lakes. And so in this particular area of the world, we have Africa's Great Lakes. And so some of Africa's biggest lakes, lakes like I said beforehand, they have a lot of settlement nearby. Here we have lakes that provide resources in terms of transportation, but also food sources. So Africa's Great Lakes are essentially formed from these plate separation, divergent plate boundaries, combined with a good amount of rainfall. And so essentially what comes in to fill the void and creates these lakes is essentially precipitation, which we can see here in this kind of this cool satellite image of these very narrow, very thin lakes that have formed along this plate boundary of separation.